I hope you guys are doing well. Inshallah, yeah, I'll be just going through this presentation regarding world systems analysis. And just at a high level, the goal is to, although this is just one approach of understanding how the world works politically, economically, socially, the goal is to just kind of open up the discussion of seeking to understand the world around us, the different factors at play that cause things, politically speaking, that cause things to happen in the global landscape. So we just want to be able to have a better bird's eye view understanding of the world around us, and what are the structural, what are these structural causes of the issues politically, socially, economically that we see today. So this is one approach. So I'll be going through world systems analysis from Ibn Khaldun to Immanuel Wallerstein, inshallah. So just a quick overview. We'll give a brief introduction, and then we'll just go through the theoretical basis of different intellectual schools of thought that was adopted by Wallerstein in his intellectual journey, and then we'll kind of have an in-depth look, understanding the core periphery relationship. We'll get to that, as well as the historical precedents of the modern world system, and also present manifestations of that. And then we can maybe have a brief discussion about understanding the importance of understanding the world system as we know it to be today. And any questions that anybody has, inshallah, we can ask them. I'll do the best that I can to answer. I know Brother Sinman said that I have a strong background. This is just my first year of kind of going through some things, had an interest in it. So I'll do the best that I can to answer any questions. But, we can also have a dialogue, and we can bounce ideas off of each other, inshallah. So jumping right into it, we're just going to go through the fundamental principles of world systems theory. And there's a book that Wallerstein wrote very recently. He has a magnum opus that goes through his stages of history from the 16th century up until the present day. But there's a smaller pamphlet that he wrote a couple of years ago before he passed away in 2019 that talks about a general analysis of it. So it's not like a whole, multi-volume work, but it's just a small pamphlet that talks about the foundations of how the theory came to be. And he cites three sources that he took to kind of produce world systems theory. The first is the long duration view of history, specifically called the Analyst School, and we'll go through that very briefly, and we'll also tie it into the work and the thought and the ideas of Ibn Khaldun, and then we'll talk about Marxism, Marxist theory of capitalism, his critique of capitalism, and then we'll talk about structuralist international relations theory and tie those three together, and then move into the actual world systems theory. So the first foundation that we just spoke about is social history, or long duration history, and this is a field of history that examines history from below, so to speak, instead of large general political scenarios that take place throughout history. Rather, what the School of Social History seeks to do is look at the underlying social structures, economic structures, cultural dynamics, and also just seeking to understand the underlying basis of political episodes, right? And as I said, one of the earliest components of history from below is Ibn Khaldun, right? In his Muqaddimah, it's a critique of the way that Muslim scholars specifically viewed history. Before, for example, I believe Tariq al-Tabari, he kind of just relays like hadith, like he relays narrations, in his historical work, right? But Ibn Khaldun, he kind of criticizes that approach, So some quotes from his muqaddimah, as you can see here, he says, they disregard the changes in the conditions and customs of nations that the time of passing had brought about. So like I said, it's just previously, it was more just like this happened and then this happened and then this happened. I'm relaying this from this person. I'm relaying this from that person. There's no analysis, if you will, about that discusses or talks about what are the underlying factors that cause things to take place, instead of just general, just series of circumstances of events. How do we understand the factors that cause things to happen? And then he also says, and this is kind of a critique of the historical philosophy of just focusing on great men. If you grew up here in America, well, I did at least, in history, we talk about Christopher Columbus, and then we talk about George Washington, and then we talk about, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln, right? It's talking about great men, not necessarily, the people's history, so to speak, right? Social history. It's just theories of great men, the ideas and the works and the circumstances of great men, and how they're the main drivers of history, right? Ibn Khaldun, he criticizes this approach when he says in his muqaddimah, they went to the extreme of being satisfied with the names of kings, and with only a numerical indication of the length of their reign. So as you can see, he's kind of criticizing that theory of great men, right? Where we've become kind of satisfied with the names of kings, or in this case, the example that I gave to you, we got satisfied with the names of presidents, of generals, of rulers, of commanders, instead of understanding like what are the conditions of the people that are being subjugated, or not even being subjugated necessarily, but just the general population in that social historical landscape. So moving on, and this is what the analysis school in France picked up, right? It arose out of France in the early 20th century, and it kind of had a general similar approach to the critique of history, right? Scholars of history came together and pushed back against the approach to history that focused on political events, diplomacy, great men. And as I said before, they focused on, in French, it's a long duration of events, and historical structures and underlying social and economic realities. So how do these realities cause, different situations and circumstances to arise in the political landscape? Okay, so the next school of thought, and this is kind of as I was doing research on this, some people kind of combine Marxism and structuralism in regards to international relations theory, but we'll try to do the best that we can to just break it down. So Marxism and structuralism, they played a big role in developing Wallerstein's theory as well. As you know, Wallerstein was an economic historian, but he was also a sociologist. So he spent a lot of time with Karl Marx. He understood his critique of capitalism, the theory of surplus value, and also Lenin's theory of imperialism, right? Vladimir Lenin, in I believe it was 1911, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 1912. He wrote a book called Imperialism, the last stage of the highest stage or last stage of capitalism. I can't remember right now, but the goal of that was to expand Marx's theory, and because Marx, he was kind of looking at it from a perspective, a very from a very central point of view, really focusing on Europe and the class relations within one country, like France or Germany, England, right, Western Europe. So what Lenin does is he kind of expands that theory of political economy to explain how competitive markets naturally progress into monopoly. So when in the theory of capitalism, when companies, you kind of hear sometimes, oh, there's freedom, there's competition, right? But the nature of capitalism is that eventually one company or one group of like bourgeois or capitalists, their business progresses into a monopoly, which kind of eats up their competition, right? So we have this one, corporation that is making all the money, right, and generating all the capital within the nation, and that leads to a surplus. And that surplus, with the help of finance, right, the financial institutions like banks and things like that, that surplus needs to be exported, right, internationally, right? So you can see where the international lens and the international point of view comes into play with Lenin. And that leads to imperialism, right? Going to export capital in search of more profits in different nations and more impoverished nations, or nations that don't have the military power to defend themselves from imperial conquest. And that leads to the extraction of resources. So there's kind of like an international point of view. And Lenin also, he theorizes that this issue of surplus capital within imperial nations is what leads to the World War I in 1914. So yeah, and then moving into structuralism. So structuralism is it has a negative outlook on the goals and the interests of nations, right? So instead of nations, the theory of structuralism cites that, instead of basically nations working together and cooperating to have collective prosperity, nations by nature, like the nation state by nature, is Machiavellian, right? It seeks to consolidate its power, is very self-interested, and it wants to maintain its own hegemony and its sovereignty to dominate over less empowered or educated nations. Okay. So one theory that developed from the idea, or from the school of structuralism, is dependency theory. So dependency theory is where we see the introduction of the terms the core and the periphery, right? The core being the United States, Western Europe, Japan, right, is another example of they had an imperial episode for some time. And even in the modern day, like Australia, kind of in the 21st century. And then the periphery, when you think of the word periphery, like, your peripheral vision, like, it's kind of off to the side, right? It's not something that's really, you don't, it's important. Like, your peripheral vision is very important, but sometimes, like, you have to lose it for you to understand how important it is, in the same way, although, like, we think of these sub-Saharan African nations as well as Middle Eastern nations and the Indian subcontinent being kind of irrelevant, right? What dependency theory says is that rather than it being like, something that's not necessarily important or irrelevant or, underdeveloped, what it says is that the core's prosperity is built upon the backs of the resources and the unskilled labor of individuals within the periphery, right? So although the periphery is impoverished, and we'll kind of get into why that is, although they are an impoverished group, what dependency theory says is that the core's prosperity is built upon the resources, the labor, the unskilled labor, and the controlled markets of the periphery. So this is where Wallerstein's usage of the term comes from. And dependency theory was kind of a pushback against more liberal modernization theory, where it says that poor nations are in a state similar to the early age of wealthy nations. So when you think of wealthy nations back in the like the 15th, 16th century, what modernization theory says is that poor nations, the modern present poor nations, are in a state that current present wealthy nations were in years ago, right? And in order for those poor nations to be brought up to speed, right, in order for those poor nations to gain wealth and skilled labor and industrialization and all those things, wealthy nations must support them. Wealthy nations must give them aid, right? But also wealthy nations, they have the right, quote unquote, to liberalize or open up their markets for international trade and things of that nature, in order for those countries to grow in their economy and things like that. So when we get into world systems theory, you'll see that there are a lot of similarities between world systems theory and dependency theory, right? They're both in the school of structuralism, or some people say Marxism. They're kind of, I guess, in this case, I mean, it's kind of interchangeable. But you'll see the difference in regards to like historical precedents and things like that, and world systems theory being focused more on historical developments, as well as the interconnected political economic system, right? That's why it's called a world system. So we'll move into world systems theory as it is presently. So world systems theory was developed by Wallerstein in the 20th century as a means of understanding the economic development of history in the modern age. So they call it the long 16th century. Why? Because this current mode of production, if you will, capitalism, going off of Marx, started around that age, right? You have the Enlightenment age and industrialization coming not too long after that, and then imperialism and conquest and seeking glory and things like that. So there is, and that mode of production that Marx and Wallerstein agree upon, which is capitalism, began at that time, and it still is presently. It still is presently in effect in the modern day. So the theory explains global economic inequality and poverty to be a direct result of the international global market in which the periphery, the semi-periphery, and core countries interact. Right. So there's a distant, more exploited periphery, and then there's a semi-periphery, which is this is in addition to dependency theory, as you can see. Right. There's a semi-periphery, which is they're exploited and also exploiting, right? They have their goal right now is in the current moment is to do as much as they can to move into the core and do as much as they can to not fall into the periphery. And then the periphery are those nations like in sub-Saharan Africa and things like that, who are perpetually exploited for their resources, and multinational corporations come in and extract those resources and things like that. So he combines the disciplines of economics, history, and sociology, as well as political science, to present a holistic view of the present world and how it came to be. So kind of like in the terms of Karl Marx, he talks about historical materialism as kind of the way that history has progressed, right, through economic modes of production. Right. So like Wallerstein kind of picks up on this, right, in the terms of the base, right, the economic base being the main driver of history, and then the superstructure being military power, culture, religion, all those different types of social institutions and political institutions. Those are what are made manifest, as a result of the chronological approach of economics, and the different modes of production as it moves through history, right? So the main driver of history, generally speaking, just to kind of summarize, is economics, right? What are the modes of production? What are these imperial powers doing, right? How does it lead to them being the global hegemon, right? And the cyclical, and how do they decline? And then how does another country or nation or empire rise to the top, right? As you can see, there's also that that cyclical nature of history that Ibn Khaldun talks about when we spoke about Ibn Khaldun. Like, he also talks about this in Muqaddimah, where nations rise and fall, right? There's one nation that maybe overspends resources and has so much colonies and territories that it costs too much for them to maintain their power, and that's what leads to their decline. And then another nation, and then so on and so forth. So this is kind of like where the interconnection of the two thinkers kind of comes into play in different disciplines within the social sciences. So going off of the characteristics of the different nations, so we kind of spoke about it a little bit. But as we said, there's the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery, right? So core countries are those countries which exploit the periphery by means of finance, capital, multinational corporations, presently speaking, and hard power. When the United States is, their military expenditure is, I believe, a couple billion dollars, which is like more than the next 10 nations on that list combined, right? And also the United States has, I believe, 150 to 170 military bases scattered across the world. So the core nations seek to maintain their hegemony over the global economic system, right? They have stronger and more complex state institutions that help to manage their economic affairs, right? They're more organized. And the central government that controls bureaucracy, and they have a central government that controls bureaucracies and also a powerful military expenditure and things like that. So they're able to maintain their hegemony through hard power, right? When you think of hard power, you think of, like, military and invasions and things like that, and soft power being like, culture and religion and stuff like that. So yeah, also core countries are more highly industrialized, and they produce more manufactured goods, right? They produce manufactured goods, and then they sell those manufactured goods at a profit back to the rest of the world, right? And that's how they're able to maintain their profits and more money coming in than leaving. Also, they have more skilled labor, right? And they tend to specialize in information, technology, and service industries. So they have, more skilled labor. You're able to kind of diversify the work that's being done within that nation, right? And there's also a lot more knowledge being produced, right? More scholarship, more ideas that are being produced, and that the rest of the world adopts, right? So examples of this, like I said, are like, the United States and Western Europe and nations like that. So, and then the semi-periphery, those are countries that are exploited to some extent, but also exploit others to some extent, right? They're kind of that midway between the core and the periphery, right? And as I said, they spend their time kind of teetering between the core and the periphery, right? So their goal is to move into the core, or just avoid falling back into the periphery. And the nature of a semi-periphery country is either a former core country that's on the decline, or a former periphery country, or a current, like, semi-periphery country that's heading into the core. So when you think of like the core on the decline, you can think of like Portugal or Spain. These are nations like back in the Spanish Inquisition. These were they had a strong navy, right? They sailed into the Caribbean, and they sailed into the Philippines and Brazil, and northern, I mean, all of South America, basically, almost all of South America, and then some countries in Africa, I believe, like Angola. And yeah, so they had like the main, they had really a stronghold on the global international market, and the global economy, right? They were the leading producers of technology, and their naval system was really elite at the time. But over time, that power kind of teetered off. It slowly went away, right? Spain lost their territories to the United States. They lost Mexico. Like Mexico used to be like Texas and California, and also the Philippines, right? They lost all of those nations. They lost all those territories to the United States, right? So slowly, like, they lost their influence, and also like there's also plenty of revolts that took place during their time of hegemony in the global system. So Spain is an example, and Portugal are examples of like former core nations that are kind of slipping into semi-periphery or like low core, and then an example of like a country that's moving into the core, a former semi-peripheral country moving into the core is like China. China, I believe by 2050 they're expected to be they're expected to be the leading world economy, right? And they're producing like a lot of they have a really good hard industry, and they produce like a lot of goods and products and things like that that are enjoyed by people all over the world. So China is kind of that example of like a semi-peripheral country that's heading into the core, or some people even say that China is the core nation right now. So just depends on who you speak to. Let's see. So yeah, they tend to import, semi-peripheral countries tend to import goods from the core, and export their goods to periphery countries, and they also can sometimes apply protectionist policies to make sure that their industrialization and manufacturing output is stronger, right? So they apply tariffs on imports and things like that to really strengthen their manufacturing and industrialization output. And then moving into the periphery, so the periphery is what you would expect it to be, right? Those are countries that are mainly exploited and resources are extracted from them, right? So when you think of sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, in Burkina Faso, for example, I mean, there's so much gold in the Congo, right? The phones that we have, the laptops, a lot of the cars that we drive, they're powered by the cobalt and different resources that are found in deep within the Congolese soil, and even during the 20th century, right? When I believe it was Belgium came into the Congo, one of the bigger industries at the time was the rubber industry, right? And in the Congo, rubber grows naturally, like it's an indigenous plant, right? It grows from the ground. There's like a rubber tree. Like you have to like scrape the bark of a tree for this like sap to come out of the tree, and that sap, it eventually hardens and becomes what we know to be rubber. So like rubber bands and the tires on our cars and stuff like that, right? That kind of that material comes from the Congo, and other resources and things like that all over the African continent. You can also think of like spices from India, right? During the time of the British, spices and tea were a big thing. Opium, and the Opium Wars in China and stuff like that. So these are all resources that are found within the so-called third world. And those resources are used to create products. Those resources are used to create products that are then sold back to, of course, like the domestic kind of proletariat, if you will, working class, within the domestic nations of the core, within the domestic boundaries of the core, and then the semi-periphery and then the periphery, right? So this is how profits and, money is maintained and kind of, held within core nations, right? So this is the relationship kind of between core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And the periphery, they also have a lot of like unskilled labor. The people are uneducated, more of like peasantry population. So with all the resources that they have, it's hard for them to do much with it, right? Because their nation is not as industrialized, right? They don't have strong central governments, right? There's always coups taking place within a lot of these nations, right? So there's not much that they can do with the resources and the products that they have, right? Typically speaking, right? Whereas in the core nations, they're more industrialized and they have a higher population of skilled labor that are able to consolidate those resources and turn them into products. Yeah, and you'll see like a lot of like corrupt rulers and leaders. For example, I'm from Nigeria, as my country of origin. My parents were born and raised there, and since independence, and this is a kind of a common theme across Africa, especially, sometimes in Latin America as well, where across the board you'll see like just dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship after corrupt leader after corrupt leader and another leader just behind closed doors working with Western imperial powers and things like that. So it's just that's kind of like that's kind of the point, right? There's like a very small, even smaller than like in America, a very small population of wealthy individuals within the nation, within a country, in peripheral countries that have a relationship with core countries that benefit themselves at the expense of the rest of the population within those nations, right? So it's a common theme across the board. You'll see it. You see it in different contexts since after the independence era or the decolonization era in the 1950s and 1960s and stuff like that. So here's a little model here. As you can see here, can you see my mouse? It's this model right here of world systems theories. You can see the core here. They're the ones that generate high profits through the goods that they're able to produce, right? But those goods can't be produced without the cheap labor and the raw materials from the periphery, right? So it becomes a cyclical relationship. As you can see, some of those goods flow into the semi-periphery, and some of the raw materials and cheap labor flows into the semi-periphery as well. So this is an interconnected relationship between these three types of nations. And this is just how, like, this is kind of like this is Wallerstein's theory of how history has progressed since, since like the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. So, yeah, as you can see here, whoops. As you can see here with this map, the blue is recognized to be the core, right? And the semi-periphery is recognized to be purple. And then the periphery is red. So here you have Canada and the United States, and here's Western Europe, all considered to be core nations, right? But interestingly enough, you see Portugal here is semi-periphery. A couple hundred years ago, Portugal would have been considered core, right? So and Spain as well, though it's here in this diagram is considered to be core. Some scholars would consider Spain to be falling into semi-periphery. So just kind of a just interesting food for thought. And then Japan here, which was an imperial nation once upon a time, they invaded China, and I believe they went to war with Russia. They went to war with Russia early in the 19th or 20th century, I believe. It's considered to be a core nation, right? You think of like Toyota, I believe Nissan and Honda. They're all originated in Japan. And then here's Australia as well, and New Zealand, right? These are semi-peripheral countries that are making their way into the core. China here is considered to be semi-periphery, but this is also the theory of Wallerstein and other people within the school of thought of world systems theory. They also theorize that China will, start to like work its way to the top in over time. What about history, right? So we kind of really broke down like economic international relations, but how does this kind of tie into history, right? So as I said, Wallerstein sees the story of the modern era, right, from 1500 onwards, to be the story of the world economy, right? Throughout the past 500 to 600 years, there have been nations that have rose to the top, bubbled their way to the top, and dominated the world. And the current one is the United States. All right, and since the onset of capitalism as a economic, social, political system, core nations have spent this period of history competing for the world's resources to seek to establish hegemony over peripheral nations. Yeah. Oh, and this is so I kind of have just a kind of a little timeline here. So of course, like I said, we start with the 1450s, in the 1400s into the 1500s. You have Spain and Portugal, right? That's the kind of like the main hegemon in the world, in the global market. And then for a brief period of time, you have the Dutch, right? When maybe some of us have heard of the Dutch East Indies Company, right? They took root in Indonesia and Malaysia. They spent some time in India, if I'm not mistaken, but their power was very short-lived. And then you have the British coming after that. And obviously, I'm kind of just brushing through everything, right? And his work and his historical books, like he explains it a little bit deeper, how nations that are on the decline, for example, the Dutch, they invest in the British. As they see the potential in the British, they invest the resources and capital into the British, right? And that's, how the British, rises to the top, and Britain did the same thing for the United States during the post-World War era, and I mean even before that, and onwards during the Cold War. Britain, its time as the global hegemon was pretty well lived. I mean, subjectively speaking, right? When you think about the amount of time from, you could say from like the 17th century up until the early to mid 19th century, after World War I and World War II, I mean, Europe was ravaged, right? Their resources and their wealth was at an all-time low, So at that point, that's when Britain starts to teeter off, and the United States opens up itself as the sole global superpower after 1945 and onwards. And their main competition throughout the Cold War was mainly Russia, and to a lesser degree China, but Russia, obviously, the USSR fell, and China has really given the United States a run for its money. And like for example, a big episode, a very big political military episode, in all of this is World War I, right? But through the analysis of economics and global systems, we see that World War I is bigger than just the Archduke of Austria-Hungary passing away. Like, it's bigger than that, right? Like, most kind of mainstream historians will say, oh, the Archduke of Austria was assassinated, and that's how World War I started. Like, no, like Lenin says it himself, and also Wallerstein says it as well, that the reason that World War I started was because of, like, the competition, the international competition of these global colonial powers, and Japan and Germany and Italy trying to get a piece of the pie, and you have the Allied powers and the Axis powers competing with one another and coming together to maintain their grip on the global economic system, right? So it's bigger than just like these big these big names. There's something beneath the surface that needs to be analyzed for you to be able to, like, understand why these big episodes happen, such as World War I. So yeah, I think that's also, so just to briefly touch on, like, post-World War era and the Cold War and things like that, there's been new forms of colonization and dominance in the global market. Typically, the term is considered to be neo-colonialism. It's theorized by different African political leaders who criticized institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank for keeping nations in debt, right? And not allowing, if for example, if like a country gets into like receives a loan from, if a country receives a loan from the IMF, right, or the World Bank, then like some of the conditions that these countries have to agree to is austerity, which is cutting budgets, either cutting budgets or raising taxes, right? So you can cut budgets in critical sectors such as education, right, such as healthcare, different things like that. That really, without these institutions like education and healthcare, it really undermines the potential and the opportunities that the individuals within the nation that has bought into such a loan or a contract. It undermines the potential of people living in those countries to prosper, right, and to reinvest in their nation, and to maintain, like, to grow their skilled labor and their economy and things like that, right? So these are some of the critiques of the IMF. Another one is resource extraction, right? That's another potential condition when a country steps into a loan with the IMF, right? It opens up their markets, right? It liberalizes their markets in order for multinational corporations to come in and extract resources and things like that. And yeah, like I said, trade liberalization. So opening up their markets for imports and exports and things like that. So this is kind of like a newer form of it's not like this hard, more raw. You have a nation coming in with a ship and just killing everybody and taking everything and leaving. No, like there's more. It's painted, and it's new. It's more hidden, but at its root is the same. Its root is the same, and the root is trying to maintain trying to maintain control over resources, and wealth and power and things like that, but just in a way that's more hidden, right? That's the critique of neocolonialism, right? In comparison to like raw colonization from from the 15th century to the early 20th century. So that kind of wraps up my my presentation. So I just wanted to share this. I wanted to share this quote by Wallerstein. He writes it in his book. It's on the 22nd page of World Systems Analysis. I wish I could have maybe shared a link or a PDF to the chat. Maybe I can do that afterwards. But what he says is that to the extent that we each analyze our social prisons, we're able to liberate ourselves from their constraints to the extent that we can be liberated, right? So obviously, like these, these systems, then this is just one interpretation of the world system, right? How the world works, right? It's a very popular one, but it's one. What he's saying is that as long as we stay ignorant or we fail to understand the global system as it works, as it is, then we can never be liberated, right? So although it might be hard to liberate ourselves through, going out and protesting in the street or, calling jihad or something like that, right? It's nearly impossible, right? Like I said, the United States is spending almost $800 billion in military expenditure. So, but one of the things that we can control, that we do have the opportunity to hold on to, is understanding the system as it works, right? Understanding how the world works, right? So what he's saying is that as much as we're able to the extent that we're able to analyze these social prisons, to the extent that we're able to analyze and understand these social economic constraints, right? We liberate ourselves from those constraints, right? We're able to see these constraints from the outside looking in, rather than us just being like pawns on a chessboard. Now we're kind of seeing it with a more clear bird's eye view, right? And this is what Allah commands us to do in the Qur'an, like to reflect and to understand, to seek to understand things around us, the world around us, right? Allah talks about it a lot in the Qur'an, right? So if we're able to do that, right, then we're able to liberate ourselves intellectually and really focus on how we can slowly but surely build steps into forging solutions to these global problems, right? So we're able to see here through one interpretation that a lot of the problems that we see today, whether it be terrorism or corrupt governments or war and military expeditions and things like that, in one way or another, they're interconnected, right? In one way or another, they're kind of part and parcel with one another and how the world has been constructed in the modern age, right? So if one thing takes place in one part of the world and another situation takes place in another part of the world, we want to be able to equip ourselves with the tools to be able to see how we can connect the dots and how they work together. Thank you guys so much for your time. Jazakumullah khair. We can kind of open up the floor for any questions that anybody might have.
Right, Jazakallah khair. Thanks, Brother Joshua. Inshallah, if you have any thoughts or questions, you can go ahead, please. I can start like a few simplifications and can it be made like, for example, Marx, the whole class struggle between the rich and the was local within a country, and Wallerstein's is more on a global scale between the countries. It's not between the individuals. Is it fair to say that the relationships that is being analyzed is between individual countries rather than a class within a country?
Yeah. So what Wallerstein is saying is that, he's pushing it from kind of like what you said, pushing it from the domestic to the international. Um, what's being said is basically that there's a global system that's been constructed, right, from the early